capacitor is smaller than a grain of rice. It sits soldered onto a circuit board, invisible unless you crack open the device and know exactly where to look. It has no brand name, no serial number, no country of origin printed anywhere on its surface. And yet, if you could trace the material inside it backward through time and geography, you would eventually arrive at a hillside in eastern Congo at the hands of a person who has never held the finished product their labour helped create. This is the story of that journey, from a hole in the ground to a factory floor to a phone charging quietly on a nightstand somewhere in the world. It is one of the most complex, opaque, and least understood supply chains in modern manufacturing. And by the time it's finished, this material will have passed through so many hands, crossed so many borders, and been transformed so completely that even the companies selling you the final product will admit, if pressed honestly, that they cannot always tell you exactly where it began. The material at the centre of this journey is called tantalum. Most people have never heard the word. Almost everyone owns something made from it. Tantalum comes from an ore called Coltan, short for columbite tantalite, a dull, dark mineral that looks to an untrained eye like nothing more than heavy dirt. What makes it valuable isn't how it looks, it's what it does. Tantalum has an extraordinary ability to store and release electrical charge in a very small space, resist corrosion, and perform reliably across a huge range of temperatures. Those properties make it close to irreplaceable in the manufacture of tantalum capacitors, tiny components that regulate power flow in almost every piece of modern electronics: smartphones, laptops, tablets, gaming consoles, medical devices, aerospace systems, and the power electronics inside electric vehicles. Roughly a third to a half of the world's tantalum supply, according to industry estimates over the past decade, has originated from Central Africa, primarily the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. The rest comes from other sources: mines in Brazil, Nigeria, and notably Australia, home to some of the largest hard rock tantalum operations on Earth, along with a growing supply from recycled electronic scrap. This matters because it means the tantalum industry has always had a choice about where to source its material. The fact that Congolese coltan remains part of the global supply, despite over a decade of conflict minerals regulation, tells you something important before we've even started tracing the journey. Demand for this mineral has consistently outpaced the industry's willingness or ability to fully walk away from its most troubled source. The journey begins, as we've described in this series before, in places like Rubaya in North Kivu province, a region that has, at various points, been controlled by the Congolese government, by armed militias, and since April 2024 by the rebel group M23, which the United Nations has linked to Rwandan military backing. Miners here, some of them children, dig coltan by hand from narrow tunnels using basic tools, working for a few dollars a day, often paying a portion of that meagre income back to whoever controls the mine as a form of tax. From the mine, the ore moves to a local trading post, typically as sacks of raw material carried by porters or transported by motorbike and truck along roads dotted with checkpoints. At each checkpoint, if the territory is controlled by an armed group, a toll is collected, a system we've explored in detail elsewhere in this series. But whether the mine is under government, cooperative or rebel control, the next step in the journey is largely the same. The ore needs to leave the region and reach a place capable of processing it into something usable. This is where an international traceability system, built with real ambition after years of advocacy from human rights organisations, was supposed to step in. Under regulations passed in the United States through the Dodd-Frank Act Section 1502 in 2010, and similar rules adopted later by the European Union, minerals originating from Congo and neighbouring countries are meant to be tagged and documented before leaving the mining site, creating a paper trail intended to follow the material all the way to the smelter. The most widely used system for this in the tin, tantalum and tungsten trade is known as ITSCI, a program run by industry associations meant to certify that a given batch of ore came from a conflict-free verified source. In practice, investigations by Global Witness and other organisations have found this tagging system can be, and repeatedly has been, circumvented, tags removed from properly sourced material and reattached to smuggled shipments, paperwork forged at trading posts where oversight is minimal. And there is the persistent unresolved statistical anomaly investigators keep returning to. Rwanda has, for years, reported tantalum export volumes that significantly exceed what its own domestic mines are capable of producing. That gap is widely believed by researchers to represent Congolese coltan, laundered across the border and relabeled with Rwandan origin, entering the legitimate market with a paper trail that no longer reflects where it actually came from. Once minerals reach an export hub, whether through legitimate Congolese channels or smuggled and relabeled through Rwanda, they are typically sold to international trading companies who consolidate shipments from multiple sources before selling onward to processors. This consolidation step is, according to supply chain researchers, one of the most opaque points in the entire chain because it's where material from dozens or even hundreds of individual mining sites of wildly varying legality and origin can be physically blended together before ever reaching a smelter. Once ore from a certified conflict-free mine sits in the same shipment or storage facility as smuggled ore from an unverified source, separating them again becomes, in practical terms, almost impossible. From there, the raw ore begins the next major leg of its journey, smelting. This is the step that transforms coltan from a dark, unremarkable rock into tantalum metal or tantalum powder, the actual usable industrial material. And it is also, according to virtually every serious traceability advocate, the single most important choke point in the entire supply chain. Here is the reason why. Once coltan is smelted, the resulting tantalum is chemically identical no matter what mine it came from. There is no laboratory test capable of looking at a bar of refined tantalum or a finished capacitor made from it and determining with certainty whether the original ore came from a legitimate audited cooperative mine or a checkpoint controlled by an armed group under UN sanctions. Before smelting, at least in theory, tags and paperwork can follow the ore. After smelting, that traceability effectively ends and the material becomes, for all practical purposes, anonymous. This is why the global tantalum industry has spent over a decade focused heavily on smelter-level certification through a program known as the Responsible Minerals Assurance Process, overseen by an industry group called the Responsible Minerals Initiative. The idea is straightforward. Rather than trying to trace every individual shipment of raw ore across every border and checkpoint in Central Africa, audit the smelters themselves, verify that a given smelter's incoming ore has been through appropriate due diligence, and certify the finished tantalum coming out the other end as conflict-free. The world's tantalum smelting capacity is concentrated in a surprisingly small number of facilities spread across a handful of countries. China hosts a significant share of global tantalum processing, with major facilities operated by companies including Ningxia Non-Ferrous Metals Smeltery and Guangdong Zhuguang Technology, among others. Kazakhstan, Thailand, Japan, Germany, and the United States also host important smelting and refining operations, with companies like Kazakhstan's Ulba Metallurgical Plant, Thailand's Thaisarco, and Germany's HC Stark, long-standing names in the industry. Each of these facilities under the certification system is meant to undergo independent audits of its sourcing practices, verifying where its incoming raw material actually comes from. For years, this system represented genuine progress. The number of tantalum smelters formally certified as conflict-free rose substantially compared to a decade earlier, and companies further down the supply chain, including major electronics manufacturers, began publishing lists of the smelters in their supply chains as evidence of due diligence. But the system's fundamental limitation has never gone away. Certification relies on the accuracy of the documentation smelters receive from their suppliers, and that documentation traces back ultimately to the same tagging and paperwork system that investigators have repeatedly found can be manipulated at the mine and trading post level, long before ore ever reaches a smelter's door. A smelter can be perfectly compliant with every audit requirement it faces and still, unknowingly, be processing ore that was laundered through a Rwandan export certificate from a mine controlled by an armed group. This is the uncomfortable structural truth sitting at the centre of the entire tantalum industry. The certification system audits the parts of the chain that are easiest to verify and struggles precisely at the point where the actual laundering has been shown repeatedly to occur. Once tantalum leaves a certified smelter as refined metal or powder, its journey accelerates and its visibility to the public disappears almost entirely. The material is sold to component manufacturers, companies that specialize in producing tantalum capacitors at industrial scale, with major producers including firms based in Japan, the United States, and increasingly China and South Korea. These capacitors, tiny and unglamorous, are then sold onward to contract electronics manufacturers, the companies that physically assemble circuit boards for consumer brands, many of them concentrated in China, Vietnam, and other manufacturing hubs across Asia. This is the point where the material finally becomes recognizable as part of a specific product. A tantalum capacitor gets soldered onto a circuit board destined for a smartphone. Another gets soldered onto a board destined for a laptop. Another finds its way into the power management systems of an electric vehicle, where reliability under stress is critical. By the time this happens, the material has typically passed through 5, 6, sometimes more distinct companies and multiple international borders, from mine to trader to exporter to smelter to component manufacturer to device assembler, with each step adding a layer of separation from the original source and each step relying on due diligence paperwork generated by the step before it. Consumer electronics brands sit at the very end of this chain, and this is where public accountability efforts have concentrated in recent years, sometimes to significant effect and sometimes with real limitations. Apple, for example, has for years published detailed conflict minerals reports, listing every smelter and refiner in its supply chain and stating its sourcing standards. In 2024, amid M23's territorial expansion and mounting evidence of laundering through Rwanda, Apple went further, instructing suppliers to suspend sourcing of tantalum, tin, tungsten, and gold from both the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda entirely, an acknowledgement that verifying conflict-free origin under current conditions had become effectively impossible, even with a certification system in place. That decision didn't stop the Congolese government from filing criminal complaints against Apple subsidiaries in France and Belgium in December 2024, alleging the company had for years used minerals laundered through international supply chains despite its sourcing claims, a case that remains unresolved and tests in a real courtroom rather than a corporate disclosure report whether due diligence as currently practiced is a meaningful standard or simply a legal shield. Other manufacturers have taken different, less publicized approaches, and the electric vehicle industry in particular has faced growing scrutiny given how much tantalum and related conflict minerals feed into battery and power management systems for a sector marketed heavily around ethical and environmental values. Investigations and reports from organizations tracking the EV supply chain have noted that the same smelter certification gaps affecting phone manufacturers apply equally to automakers, many of whom rely on multiple tiers of parts suppliers with even less direct visibility into raw material origin than smartphone brands, which tend to have more concentrated and better documented supply chains. There is, running parallel to this entire mined and smelted pipeline, a second and steadily growing source of tantalum that carries none of this baggage: recycling. Tantalum capacitors and scrap from decommissioned electronics can be reprocessed to recover usable tantalum, and several certified smelters now process significant volumes of recycled material alongside newly mined ore. Industry advocates point to recycling as one of the most promising long-term paths to reducing reliance on conflict-affected mining regions altogether, since recycled tantalum requires no new extraction and carries a far more traceable, contained origin story. But recycling currently accounts for only a portion of overall global tantalum supply, nowhere near enough to replace primary mining. And it depends on functioning electronics recycling infrastructure that remains inconsistent, underdeveloped in much of the world, including in many of the countries that consume the most electronics in the first place. Alternative primary sources also exist and have grown in relevance. Australia's Wodgina and Greenbushes operations, among the largest hard rock tantalum and lithium deposits in the world, offer a mining environment with dramatically different labour conditions, regulatory oversight and traceability compared to artisanal mining in eastern Congo. Some manufacturers have shifted a portion of their sourcing toward these more verifiable alternatives, specifically to reduce their exposure to the Central African supply chain certification gaps. But global demand for tantalum, driven by the relentless growth of consumer electronics, data infrastructure, and electric vehicles, has continued to outpace what these alternative sources alone can supply, which means Central African coltan, including material passing through territory controlled by armed groups, has remained a persistent, structurally necessary part of the global market, rather than a peripheral one. So where does this leave the tantalum sitting inside your own device right now? The honest answer, according to the researchers and organisations who have spent years studying this exact question, is that certainty is never possible at the individual consumer level. A phone or laptop purchased from a major manufacturer today is far more likely to contain tantalum that passed through an audited RMAP certified smelter than one purchased 15 years ago, before these certification systems existed at all. That represents genuine, measurable progress, and it would be inaccurate to claim nothing has improved. But certification of a smelter is not the same as certainty about every gram of ore that entered it, and the specific, well-documented mechanism by which Congolese coltan can be laundered through Rwandan export certificates means that even a fully compliant smelter, following every audit requirement asked of it, cannot always guarantee the ultimate origin of the material it processed years or even months earlier. This is, in the end, what makes tantalum's journey from Congo to your charger such a uniquely difficult problem to solve. Not a lack of regulation, because significant regulation exists, and not a total absence of industry effort, because certification systems, corporate sourcing bans, and recycling investment all represent real institutional responses. The difficulty lies in a physical and chemical reality that no amount of paperwork can fully overcome. Once ore becomes metal, its story disappears into the material itself, and every safeguard built into this supply chain exists at a stage before that transformation happens, trying to catch a problem that, by design and by geography, is engineered to be caught only after it's already too late. Somewhere right now, a truck is crossing a border with sacks of ore whose true origin no export certificate can fully verify. Somewhere right now, that ore is arriving at a smelter that will process it alongside material from dozens of other sources, indistinguishable once melted. And somewhere right now, a capacitor smaller than a grain of rice, carrying tantalum that made this exact journey, is being soldered onto a circuit board that will end up, weeks later, inside a box on a store shelf, marketed as the newest, most advanced version of a device millions of people will hold in their hands without ever asking the question this documentary has spent its entire length trying to answer. The tantalum industry will tell you, correctly, that it has built systems to solve this problem. The evidence suggests just as clearly that those systems have never been strong enough to close the specific gap where the laundering happens. Both of those things are true at once, and until that contradiction is resolved, the journey from Congo to your charger will keep running exactly the same route it has for over a decade. Mine, checkpoint, border, smelter, factory, and finally, quietly into your hands. If this documentary helped you see the hidden path behind an everyday object in a way you never had before, share your thoughts in the comments. This is a conversation worth having honestly. If you found this valuable, please share it, because supply chain transparency only improves when enough people understand what questions to ask. And if you want more deeply researched documentaries that trace the hidden journeys behind the objects we take for granted, like this video and subscribe, because there is more of this story still waiting to be uncovered.